on his Lordship's mysterious ascent, a Cliff Notes story about the American Revolution. Originally adapted from an article written in November 1998. In the pre-dawn darkness of November 20th, 1776, a wooden keel scrapes against a stone jetty in the Hudson River, and the invasion of New Jersey begins. The cold rain that started overnight continues as hour after hour boats land at the base of the towering Palisades cliffs. Armed men, including British regulars and Hessians from distant German states, disembark to climb the primitive road to the summit. Dawn will reveal dozens of boats still lined up on the river, protected by warships looming from the mist. Those troops already on the steep footpath feel vulnerable, anxious to reach the top. For many, this is their first taste of real wilderness. They watch for snakes, for wild animals, and most dangerous of all, enemy forms among the bare tree trunks. They sense that a handful of rebels could pin them here all day with musket fire, or even by hurtling stones down upon them. By 10 in the morning, the full invasion force is assembled on the cliff top, still unopposed. Their presence has not yet been noticed by the rebels. Drums sound in the drizzle as 5,000 men, led by Lieutenant General Lord Charles, Earl of Cornwallis, begin the march south toward the rebel stronghold of Fort Lee. The mist closes behind them. Part 1. The Headquarters. For 2 centuries or more, this stone and wooden house has stood on the Hudson's edge, now the last of its kind. In the early 1900s, when the Interstate Park took over the fishing village known as Alpine Landing, earlier called Closter Landing, the Park Commission made the house into a police headquarters. A station it would stay until the 1920s, when a larger headquarters was built atop the cliffs. No longer needed, the house would most likely follow the fate of its neighbors and be razed to the ground. Embedded in the folklore of Alpine Landing, however, was the belief that this little house had filled a unique niche in the history of the American Republic, that it had served, very briefly, as the headquarters of George Washington's greatest enemy. Here, Lord Cornwallis had spread his maps upon a humble American table. General Cornwallis, whose brilliant surprise assault had spurred Washington's famous retreat across the Jerseys to the Delaware. It was said that here his lordship sipped an ale, served to him by a fair Dutch-American tavern hostess named Rachel Kearney, as his army trampled by the little house with the hope that their march on Fort Lee might end the revolt in the colonies. It was, quite simply, a historical story too compelling to ignore. Or so argued the New Jersey State Federation of Women's Clubs and others. So the house became what was claimed to be the nation's only historic shrine dedicated to an enemy general. Just ignore half the players in the Civil War, I suppose. But had it really been Cornwallis's headquarters? Even in the 1930s, as dedication ceremonies were planned with the Federation, doubts were raised, including those expressed by a Mrs. Maria Demarest Kearney Myers, then 88 and living in Teaneck. Maria was the granddaughter of Rachel Kearney, the purported tavern hostess who served General Cornwallis. Mrs. Myers pointed out that while her grandmother had indeed been living in the little house on the river, Rachel Kearney was not born until 1780. That is 4 years after Cornwallis visited New Jersey. The article featuring Mrs. Myers ended with, "At least we have conclusive proof that the part which Rachel Kearney was reputed to have played in the story is nothing but a myth. That the house was even for a few hours Cornwallis's headquarters may be equally mythical." It was the minority opinion, however. One lost amid the hoopla of a dedication ceremony and the opening of a house to the public. Artifacts and antiques had been donated from across the state for the new house museum. Stories of Cornwallis's ghost were even mentioned, how it would return on the anniversary of the invasion to tread upon the old road to the summit. A brass plaque was forged and placed by the doorway. "Cornwallis Headquarters," the metal letters proclaimed, "November 18th, 1776. Even though the ascent happened 2 days later, on November 20th. Part 2. A Tale of Two Landings. In the early 1960s, John Spring, historian for the borough of Cresskill, began to research the history of Hyler's Landing, another Palisades landing point and farm road about 1.5 miles south of Closter Landing. He would learn that Hyler's had in fact been quite a lively place hundreds of years ago. Named for George Hyler, a plantation owner in what would become Cresskill, the road up the cliffs had been a major artery between the farmlands of Bergen County and the Hudson. Long vanished, a small but bustling community had developed at the landing, its livelihood dependent upon the flow of commerce between the valley and the river. In addition, Spring learned Hyler's Landing had once been called something else, Lower Closter Landing. What was later called the Closter Landing, where the Alpine Boat Basin and the Cornwallis headquarters now stood, was once called Upper Closter Landing. An idea began to dawn on Spring, and he set out to explore the records of the campaign of 1776. The more he read, the more convinced he became in his theory. Closter Landing, in Revolutionary accounts, was in fact Lower Closter Landing, what would become some decades later Hyler's Landing. John Spring became convinced, in other words, that Cornwallis had in fact landed more than 1 mile south of where everyone said he did, where people insisted his headquarters was. John Spring's findings didn't create much of a stir until about 10 years later, when the American Bicentennial celebration was planned for 1976. And then things got a bit crazy for Spring. He suddenly found himself caught up in a heated debate among local historians, who had for decades taken the headquarters designation at face value. Things became particularly dicey when reenactors planned to retrace Cornwallis's route on the 200th anniversary of the invasion. Where were they to begin? A war of articles and op-ed pieces ensued, mostly pitting Spring against Dr. Peter Henderson, another local historian and an advocate of the traditional landing site. A compromise was finally reached, however. Those reenacting the British invasion split their forces, half using the Alpine Landing, half using Hyler's Landing. The Bergen County Historical Society, meantime, had sided solidly with John Spring's account of the invasion. As more evidence emerged, the more clear it became that that was the route the army had used. Part 3. The Road Since. In maintaining and interpreting the Palisades Interstate Park and the historic sites within it, we've found that history and folklore form a complex tapestry that sometimes makes it difficult to tell truth from fiction. People to this day come up and insist the Carney House was where Cornwallis stayed. We try to make information accessible that challenges outdated information. Local history plays an important role in what we do. How people remember historic events in different time periods is always fascinating to see in action. Even if people remember the wrong story, you can follow the breadcrumbs to figure out why a myth stays with us. As for the Cornwallis headquarters, plaque and myth, without it, the Carney House would have been knocked down a century ago. For this reason, we sort of like the guy. Call us superstitious, but Cornwallis is like our patron saint. We don't have the Cornwallis headquarters plaque outside of the house anymore, but it is still inside as an example of how messy history can be. Now, we can tell the stories of those who lived there for generations instead. John Spring was there in 2008 when we removed the plaque, which he proved had misinformed generations of park visitors, and by the time he passed away in 2015, his little theory was the authoritative account of what happened that day on November 20th, 1776, on his lordship's ascent up the Palisades.